Hello, you're listening to Kopi Time, a podcast series on markets and economies from DBS Group Research. I'm Taimur Beg, Chief Economist. Welcome to our 70th episode. Today, we will talk about trade. While the last few years have been all about tariffs and trade wars, and lately one hears a lot about pandemic-driven supply-side disruptions, the fact of the matter is trade is actually going rather well. Last year, despite all the port congestions and labor shortages, global trade volume rose by about 10% year on year and is on course to rise by another 4 to 6% this year. So perhaps trade wars are not all that one makes them out to be, and maybe there are some layers of nuance here. So let's take this discussion to a foremost expert on this subject. Razeen Sally is Associate Professor at the Kuan School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. He is Chairman of the Institute of Policy Studies, the main economic policy think tank in his native Sri Lanka, although I know that Razeen mostly spends his time in Wales these days. Previously, he taught at the London School of Economics. He has been director of the European Centre for International Political Economy, a global economy think tank in Brussels. He has also held visiting research and teaching positions in numerous universities and think tanks around the world. Professor Razeen Sally, welcome to Kopi Time.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be with you.
It's our pleasure. You focus on global trade policy and Asia's place in the world economy. So let's begin by talking about the intersection of those two. RCEP and also perhaps CPTPP. So let's start with RCEP. What's your take on its genesis, and how do you see it taking shape in terms of regional trade and Asia's place in the world economy?
Well, I think the relevant background to both RCEP and the CPTPP is Asia's big turn to free trade agreements going back around the year 2000. I mean, up until the year 2000, or close to it, there was just a handful of FTAs, so-called, in the region. And then there was a big shift, which actually Singapore pioneered. The first FTA was between Singapore and New Zealand. And in the last 20 years or so, we've seen about 174 at the last count, FTAs in Asia Pacific. There are no countries left out. Singapore has almost 30 of these FTAs, China almost 20, India close up, and so on. And what we saw initially was that these FTAs were mainly bilateral, country to country. But in the past decade, we've seen a kind of agglomeration effect into so-called mega-regional FTAs. And the two main ones, of course, are RCEP and CPTPP. RCEP is a direct reaction to the origin, the genesis of the CPTPP, which started among 4 small open economies in the region, including Singapore. And then the US joined, and it morphed into the TPP. RCEP is a response because China was excluded from those initial plurilateral arrangements. And it wasn't just China that wanted to get involved in this mega regional bandwagon, but other countries as well who didn't want to exclude China, including Japan, including the ASEAN countries, and India and others. This was, of course, at a time when everyone thought that there would be ever closer integration between China and the rest of the world economy, and thought that that would be a good thing, including the United States. So I think that in a nutshell, is the genesis of RCEP. RCEP, which actually came into operation, I think it was last year, is the biggest trade agreement in the world, next to the WTO. The WTO, of course, is multilateral with 164 members. But RCEP, with its 14 members, I think it is, it's the ASEAN countries, China, South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, but not India. India exited at the last moment. RCEP accounts for about 30% of world trade. So it's the biggest regional trade agreement in the world. India not in it actually doesn't make that much difference in terms of overall trade value and trade volumes, because in South Asia is only 5% of Asia's trade. The bulk of it is East Asia, and the bulk of that is Northeast Asia, China, South Korea, and Japan. The linchpin, the mainstay of RCEP is actually a free trade agreement between China, South Korea, and Japan. So it's big, and in that sense, important. But if we look at the actual content of the provisions and how they're likely to be applied, RCEP is what I would call a shallow free trade agreement. And that fits the pattern of intra-Asian FTAs going back 20 plus years ago since this movement started. So what RCEP does, in terms of a thumbnail sketch, is basically remove tariffs on 90% plus of tariff lines over a long transition period, about 20 years. That's important because tariffs are not completely insignificant. And that's important not least to multinationals and their global value chains. But beyond the tariffs, RCEP actually does very little, and in some cases, close to nothing. So it has very weak provisions, pretty much along the lines of what's already in the WTO, on areas like services regulation, investment, standards provision, and so on. It's silent on public procurement, and it has a weak enforcement mechanism. So when it comes to non-tariff barriers and regulatory barriers, which are actually much, much bigger impediments to cross-border trade and associated investment flows than tariff barriers per se, RCEP is very weak, along the lines of other Asian FTAs. So in terms of RCEP's tangible effects on business, and particularly on multinationals and their cross-border value chains, I don't expect RCEP to make a huge difference. It will make some difference, but not, I think, a huge difference. RCEP, of course, is not just about bread and butter economics. It's about wider symbolism as well as geopolitics. And of course, when one thinks of these wider issues, one thinks of China. China is definitely first among equals in RCEP, doesn't necessarily dominate it. Japan is there, of course. So it's not just a one-country show. But of course, RCEP is an instrument of Chinese leadership in the wider Asia. Alongside China in the BRI and China on security issues. So I think geopolitically speaking, RCEP should be seen in that constellation. It is one of a number of instruments of China's display of leadership in the region.
You said earlier that the linchpin of RCEP is this Korea, Japan, China free trade arrangement, which did not exist before. And it seems to me that trade models that try to estimate the potential impact of RCEP are basically looking at the gains from that area, which then sort of percolates to the rest of the region. But since we're sitting in Singapore and we are looking at ASEAN around us, to the extent that countries like Thailand would see a significant amount of their goods that could go in and out, see substantial reduction in tariff, do you see the supply chain in ASEAN benefiting materially and immediately from RCEP?
I think my answer would be marginally and over time, rather than significantly and immediately. Don't forget, Chinese tariffs on average are pretty low.
Yes.
They're 10% or less. Not insignificant, but we're not talking averages in the double digits. And when it comes to manufacturing goods, the effective Chinese tariffs are actually very low, in line with their WTO commitments. Chinese WTO commitments are much stronger than they are for the likes of India, Brazil, and older members of what was the GATT, what became the WTO. So RCEP's main effects are going to be on the tariffs. It's going to be staged over time, particularly when it comes to sensitive products in agriculture in particular. But the main barriers are not the tariffs per se, and on what barriers there are behind borders. In China, in the ASEAN countries, putting Singapore to one side, RCEP, I think, will do very little. And don't forget, value chains in terms of unimpeded or less impeded cross-border trade are much more about tackling non-tariff barriers. Things like, how open are you to services? How open is the door to foreign investment? How strong is intellectual property rights protection? How business friendly are standards? And not least, how open is digital trade? How open are you to e-commerce? How open are you to services that relates to manufacturing? All of those things are 95% about inside the border regulation, not about the tariffs and the quotas at the border. And that's where RCEP, along with the other Asian FTAs, is pretty weak.
So let's stay on that subject for a little longer. So you talked about the fact that, it may have chapters on data and services and dispute resolution, but enforcement mechanisms are on the softer side and therefore may not have a lot of teeth. You also mentioned that within the construct of RCEP, China is somewhat the first among equals, although you have heavyweights like Japan there. Does that mean on the big issues of this generation, whether it is climate change related regulation, or carbon pricing, or border adjustment tax related to climate change, as well as data privacy and data regulation, in these areas, China will sort of lead the way in the region?
China is definitely one of the models and one leader, but I don't think it's only up to China. Effectively, when we talk about these new generation issues in trade, on which the WTO is almost silent.
That's right.
Border adjustment tax, digital commerce, data privacy, and that sort of thing. Effectively, what we're seeing is what's, of course, now commonly called the splinter net phenomenon. And we see a competition between the Chinese model, the EU model, which prioritizes data privacy, and the US model, which is basically about cross-border flows of data for big business. Chinese model being much more about national control, national sovereignty, national champions, and national industrial policy. It's a competition among those three models, but that competition is largely fought out, almost exclusively fought out, outside formal trade policy and formal trade agreements. RCEP has practically nothing to say about these issues, along the lines of the WTO. RCEP is very much about, if you like, mid to late 20th century trade rules. It's not really about early 21st century trade rules. Now, the big exception to that in terms of mega regional deals is the CPTPP. The CPTPP is very different in terms of content to RCEP. And it's the one, if you like, trade agreement with critical mass that has something to say, at least in Asia Pacific, that has something to say on at least some of these issues, not all of these issues that you listed.
So let's then talk about CPTPP, because you also mentioned earlier that even when we think of RCEP, we have to think about the geopolitical context, and of course, geopolitics looms big on top of CPTPP. Where is it going, and what role will China play in it?
where it's going, I think, is uncertain. I doubt China will become a member in the foreseeable future, but let me come to that. Now, I mentioned that earlier with respect to RCEP that India not being in it doesn't make much of a difference in terms of actual trade. Of course, if we look at it dynamically, India not being in RCEP is important because it effectively excludes that South Asian part of what is supposed to be a Pan-Asian, or what was supposed to be a Pan-Asian agreement. Now it's pretty much an East Asia plus Australasia agreement. It's different with the CPTPP. The CPTPP, in terms of content, is very much a US model agreement. When the US joined that bandwagon, it effectively took the negotiations over. I'm simplifying somewhat. And its provisions look very much, with marginal exceptions, like a model US FTA. The US shooting itself in the foot and leaving the CPTPP, the TPP, makes a huge difference, because what would have been 25% of international trade is now 15% of international trade. So now Japan becomes, in terms of actual trade, the dominant presence in the CPTPP, absent the United States. If the United States had been in it, if the United States comes back to it, then the fulcrum of the CPTPP will effectively be a strong FTA between the US and Japan, which doesn't exist at the moment. So in terms of basic trade facts, the United States not being in it does make a huge difference. That said, CPTPP is important, primarily because Japan is in there. So less important in terms of overall trade volumes, 15% as opposed to 30%, compared with RCEP, but still important. I think what's more important about CPTPP is the nature, the content of its rules, and the fact that it's there, it's just started operation, and provides, if you like, a demonstration effect of how different trade can be with 21st century trade rules, if you like, compared with RCEP and other agreements. Because the CPTPP, on the model of the original TPP, not only does a lot more on tariffs and far quicker than RCEP, but much more importantly, provides pretty strong disciplines going beyond WTO rules on the areas like services, investment, public procurement, supply chains, digital trade, extending to labor and environmental standards that RCEP is very weak or silent about. So it probably will have more of an effect on multinationals and their value chains than RCEP, because it does deal, at least in terms of its provisions, with these non-tariff regulatory barriers. Enforcement is also a question with the CPTPP. Its formal enforcement mechanisms are stronger than they are with RCEP. But we'll see if they'll be tested and applied. So far they haven't been, but it's very early days.
You said earlier that, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Taimo.
No, I was just going to say that you had said earlier that when you read the provisions inside of CPTPP, it looks like a strong US FTA agreement. I was just thinking while you're saying this that, well, we did see one update to a US written agreement, which was the NAFTA, became USMCA under Trump. Do you see that as an example of modernizing old trade provisions and making trade more relevant, or is there not that much to take away from that?
Well, I mean, I come from a broadly open trade, rules-oriented perspective. So I would regard, in a world of imperfections, the TPP model as something positive and progressive. I wouldn't say that about the USMCA as an update of NAFTA. It could have been much worse. it effectively salvaged NAFTA, which I think is important. But the update of the rules is very much in a protectionist direction, and that was basically Mexico and Canada conceding to the reality of a very protectionist Trump administration in the United States. Now, if the CPTPP and other agreements go in that direction, I would regard that as regressive, not progressive. It may be the price to pay down the line to get the United States back into the arrangement. We'll see. But those kinds of updates are, if you like, throwing at the least sand in the wheels of international trade rather than greasing them, as it were.
So the Trump administration was unambiguous in its skepticism toward gains from trade. And of course, we all know about the tariff war. But when Joe Biden became president, expectations were muted that he was not going to be able to get the U.S. out of the Trump straitjacket of tariff. And now more than a year has gone by. Trump-era tariffs are in place. There's been very little by way of substantive conversation on regional leadership. And then even beyond trade, there was this Indo-Pacific strategy document that was released a couple of weeks ago, and it was like 12 pages of generalities, nothing special. So the U.S., which was both a bastion of free trade as well as sort of role of multilateral institutions, even under Biden, seems not to be getting much traction. What's your take on this?
I'll come to that, Taima, but I just realized that I didn't properly answer the question, or you asked me before about where the CPTPP is heading, because one crucial answer to that question is whether China will become a member or not.
Right.
So let's just get back to that for a moment. I mean, it's a possible reality that, especially given the US's absence and the overweening importance of China in East Asia in particular, that China might become a member. That will make a huge difference, because I think China is in a different sort of trade game, which is much more mercantilist, becoming increasingly mercantilist. There are several areas. There are areas where China could relatively easily comply with the rules of the CPTPP, particularly on tariffs and other border issues. But on some of the key non-border issues, notably state-owned enterprises, subsidies, digital trade, China is going in one direction and diverging from the CPTPP rule base. So in a technical sense, for China to conform to CPTPP rules, I think will be very difficult. Even if they do so, I think there's a big question about bona fides. And let me be blunt here. I think those who argue that China can join the CPTPP and then will abide by its rules are either naive, and in that sense, useful idiots of the Chinese Communist Party, or willfully ignorant. In that sense, paid up fellow travelers of the Chinese Communist Party. I just don't see it happening. If China gets in, it will ruin the arrangement and take the rules in a different direction. And of course, what China is doing to Australia is a good indication. And that's despite RCEP and despite the WTO, is a good indication of what it might do to other CPTPP members. So I think the idea that the CPTPP could, if you like, civilize China in a trade sense is either naive or willfully ignorant, because China is going in a different direction. Taiwan, which of course is also applied, I think is in much better shape to join the CPTPP. Technically, it would have far fewer problems than China because it's a much more open economy, though still some problems on services and other areas. But it's also highly unlikely that I think Taiwan will join, because there are members of the CPTPP who don't want to offend China and who are also in RCEP. So that's probably too big of a geopolitical football or hot potato, whichever metaphors one would like to use. I think it's more likely that South Korea and the United Kingdom will become members of the CPTPP. I think it makes logical sense for both. The UK, of course, is far away, but there's nothing in the CPTPP to exclude a non-Asia Pacific member. In terms of trade in the region, South Korea joining will be much more important. They are less geopolitically sensitive than China and Taiwan. So I suspect what will happen is that the existing TPP members will perhaps kick the Chinese and the Taiwanese cans down the road, while perhaps advancing the South Korean and the British applications. That's my broad take on, if you like, that whole accession issue. To get back to Trump, Biden, US trade policy, and of course the wider geopolitical canvas, I mean, yes, perhaps the broad expectation, somewhat naively, with the benefit of hindsight, was that Biden multilateral rhetoric with dulcet tones would translate into changes in US trade policy compared with the Trump era. That has not happened. Again, if one thinks of a historical perspective, there was this bipartisan consensus on the US effectively leading global trade and leading the setting of trade rules in a fairly open multilateral direction, and then with FTAs. That consensus became less bipartisan over time and then broke down with the beginning of the Trump administration. And if anything, we see a movement towards bipartisan protectionism in the United States that straddles both the Democrats and the Republicans. We had the most isolationist, narrow, transactional, mercantilist president the United States has seen since the 1920s in the form of Donald Trump. That translated into US trade policy across all the fronts. And of course, the centerpiece of that was the US-China trade war, which morphed from a tariff war to a tech war and now a financial war. Now, I think a lot of us had hoped that we would see a significant change in that. The US, if you like, tacking back closer to its old positions on trade with the Biden administration, and that has not happened. What we've seen rather is much, much more continuity in trade policy from the Biden to the Trump administration than change. So the US has maintained its Trump levels of protection against China. The WTO is way, way, way down the priority list. US trade policy has become extremely inward-looking. The unions, which are basically protectionist in the United States, are closer to dominating trade policy than they've ever been, probably in the post-war era, replacing the steel industry's influence in the Trump administration. But the steel industry, of course, is a protectionist industry in the United States, which unites both labor and capital. So continuity rather than change. The talk is very much of a middle-class and worker-centric trade policy, which is effectively about, the bottom line of that is protecting sunset industries in the Rust Belt of the United States from import competition. And promoting areas like labor standards and environmental standards at the expense of trade opening. And to complete this list, no interest in further freer trade initiatives. So certainly no interest in joining the CPTPP for the foreseeable future, and no interest in the kind of FTA initiatives that the United States had roughly from the early 2000s until the second term of the Obama administration. So I think from an open trade perspective, this is not good news because the United States is the traditional leader of this agenda. It leaves a vacuum in our part of the world, which of course is there for China to exploit. And if you like, second best substitutes like the CPTPP in the form of a plurilateral coalition, China, Japan, Japan, Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, is certainly not a full substitute for United States leadership in these areas.
Yeah, I mean, it's disappointing, but it is what it is.
Yeah.
We've talked to several U.S. administration, current and past officials in recent months, and the most they can say is, well, the tone is better, and you will not get any new punitive measures from the U.S. But taking down tariff at times like this is next to impossible. There's basically no political space for that. But of course, the flip side of the increasingly isolationist U.S. is this new China, which at least on paper is talking about opening up to greater trade and cooperation. So you said a couple of things in the context of China earlier. I'd like you to sort of expand on that. So one was that the inclusion of China in a deal like CPTPP would sort of ruin it. I think you were alluding to sort of China's heft and its ability to sort of play by its own rules, even when it's inside a multilateral framework. And the second was that China is playing a sort of a new mercantilist game. So tell us about that.
Well, I think with China, we have a pretty radical departure on the economy, broadly speaking, as well as trade and including geopolitics, roughly from the global financial crisis onwards, and particularly during the past decade of the Xi Jinping era. So before that, China was very much about opening and globalizing and joining the various rules of the American-led order, including trade. So it's, I think, with that canvas in mind that we can understand China applying to join the WTO, joining the WTO, and then operationalizing its WTO commitments. And the initial wave of FTAs that China was involved in, including the China-ASEAN arrangements, and including the beginnings of RCEP. However, what we've seen, as I said, roughly post-GFC, is something quite different. And as with the United States, it starts with developments at home. So we have, particularly under President Xi, a much more mercantilist strategy in terms of domestic economic policy, a much more interventionist state, a bigger, more powerful public sector in terms of state-owned enterprises, continued control of the financial system by the state, and now, of course, much more state involvement and direction of that private sector engine of Chinese development. And alongside that, of course, and very much allied to it, much more authoritarian and borderline totalitarian control by the state of Chinese society. Now, that inevitably spills over into international trade. So what we have seen roughly in the past 10 to 15 years is much more Chinese protectionism. Not so much on the tariffs, and China's tariff retaliation to US tariff hikes has been relatively muted, but it's much more on those crucial non-tariff barriers, like protection of its services markets, protection against foreign investment in a wider range of so-called strategic sectors, China-specific standards, turbocharged industrial policy, turbocharged technology policy, subsidies, state-owned enterprises, digital issues. In all of these areas, we see a much more inward-looking and protectionist China. It's reflected, of course, in Made in China 2025 and now the dual circulation policy. And that has an inevitable trade spillover. And it makes a difference to the world economy simply because of China's size. So it's of a different order to what Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and the other Asian tigers did in previous decades of industrial policy. So in this sense, the American backlash and also now the EU backlash is understandable because it's a response to what China has done. So I think we see tangible effects of China being much more mercantilist in the past decade or more. And again, I think we have to separate the reality from the rhetoric. And those who actually believe China's multilateral rhetoric, including President Xi's speech in Davos 2 years ago, I think it was, are again, and I will put this bluntly, either useful idiots or fellow travelers, because there is a huge disconnect between China's rhetoric for particular audiences of the gullible and China's actual deeds. And I think to put this in terms of the really big picture, China is now the world's leading mercantilist power. And trade is increasingly coming to resemble, if you like, China's more overt and blatant displays of mercantilist power. And the most overt and blatant display of it is through the BRI. The BRI fundamentally is a hub and spoke relationship where China has strictly bilateral relations with dependent countries on infrastructure, with Chinese financing. And although, of course, there are multilateral and other checks on this, on trade, and China has a veneer of multilateralism and has the rhetoric to go alongside it, the reality is increasingly what China does to countries like Australia and Lithuania, which is bilateral, which is arbitrary, and which breaks established rules. That's, I think, the way it's heading as a logical outcome of what President Xi is doing at home politically and economically. And that also fits the geopolitical picture as well. So in that sense, China as a mercantilist power on trade and other fronts, I think, has its parallels with, historically, with Germany and Japan in the late 19th century and in the first half of the 20th century. If you look at those historical parallels, there was initially a fairly liberal Prussia on trade, which then became a much more protectionist Prussia, and then a warlike Germany. Japan, similarly, there was, if you like, a relatively more liberal Meiji period up until about 1890, and then a much more protectionist, inward-looking, and then militaristic Meiji period post-1890. And I think we see a similar transition with China as a rule taker of liberal rules set by the others, particularly the United States, and then when it acquired a certain size as the rising power, becoming a much more illiberal rule maker or rule shaper. Let's hope that this doesn't end up with the way we ended up with an illiberal Japan and an illiberal Germany in the 1930s and the 1940s.
Right. I mean, it is absolutely fascinating that China's scale itself creates so many sort of, almost contradictory narratives. So on one hand, I fully agree with you that China's domestic markets are not fully open the way, free trade economies tend to be with respect to access to market share and the rules of the game that is, observed by foreigners versus local entities. But at the same time, when we look at investment data. China is one of the largest recipients of foreign direct investment from the world. Europe in particular is a very large investor in China, and it continues to do so. So even through the years of trade war and through the years of the pandemic, we haven't really seen any abatement of global investment flows into China. I'm just talking in terms of foreign direct investment, but it's also true for financial flows, where the US has tried to put a lot of sand in the wheel, but portfolio managers, not only just from the rest of the world, but also from America, seem to still be very keen to go along various Chinese assets. And also, when I travel through China, I mean, this is, of course, a superficial observation, but one sees the Chinese as amenable to consuming Western brands as any other consumer in the world. So you walk around Shanghai, all you see are European and American brands, not that many US brands. So, I mean, not that many Chinese brands. So the question that I have for you is there a grand design to be fully inward, or China is trying to find some sort of a sweet spot where it pursues mercantilist policies when it suits it, but at the same time remains open to global ideas and brands and nice things that it likes to consume and does not produce on its own?
I think it's. I mean, my answer to that is closer to your second observation than your first observation. So, I think a globalized China has gone too far to turn it back to something completely inward-looking, notwithstanding the size of the domestic market. I mean, it's certainly possible, given the size of China, for it to be closer in the direction of self-sufficient, but at huge economic cost, of course. I don't think the Chinese leadership is that delusional. I think what they are looking for is, as you put it, a sweet spot, where they establish more control of China's future on all fronts, including the economic front, while remaining open and globalized in areas that they don't see as threatening to the political monopoly of the Communist Party. So in that sense, it's bifurcated. I mean, if you look at the thrust of, if you like, the more mercantilist grand designs of the last decade, from indigenous innovation to made in China 2025 to now the dual circulation economy, you will, I think, see that bifurcation. The list of strategic industries gets bigger and bigger. It extends into services and high tech. But so far, if you like, the retail and consumer industries have been left to one side, because that's where you see the primary foreign penetration. Those brands you see in Showcase Shanghai, as it were. And I think it's that part of the economy up to date, where you see Western multinationals who are now hugely reliant on the Chinese market, 10 to 30% of global sales. In other words, they can't afford not to be there. As an acquaintance of mine in the expat business community in China puts it, in these sectors, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. But these are areas, including, for example, Apple in China, which I think are not considered threatening to the party and the way it wants to steer the Chinese polity, the Chinese economy, and Chinese society. Now, of course, there isn't a clear dividing line between what is threatening and what is non-threatening. So I think that they are looking for that sweet spot, but that sweet spot is quite different to what it was 10 or 15 years ago.
Absolutely. Okay, put the great powers aside. Let's talk about our good old Singapore. You began the podcast by pointing out that Singapore was one of the first pushers toward free trade in the region. How does Singapore sort of position itself in this great power rivalry and its own commitment to, free access for both trade and services?
I think it's in a very awkward position, and certainly not in a position where it wants to be. Again, I think some historical perspective is important. If we think of eras when Singapore has prospered as a small, open, highly globalized economy, it was, when it was a British colony in the Pax Britannica, as one of the two main entrepôts in Asia for the British. And then post-1965, until fairly recently, so this span of about 60 to 70 years, under the Pax Americana, and with an increasingly liberal, open, global economic order. And that's, I think, the big canvas for Singapore's takeoff and transition from labor-intensive, light manufacturing exports to more capital-intensive exports, to services, to higher value goods, and then this global city phenomenon that we've experienced in Singapore over the past couple of decades or so, where Singapore is effectively one of Asia's two global cities, mainly through services, connecting Asia to other parts of Asia and the rest of the world. So, we have a certain broad context of geopolitics and economics, which has enabled this kind of Singapore trajectory. We are now, I think, in a very different global context and regional context. Geopolitics, of course, is more conflictual. It's more charged, revolving around the US-China conflict. And I think we've shifted from that broadly liberal order to a fairly new, emerging mercantilist order on trade and other economic fronts. So where does this leave Singapore? Singapore's future prosperity, I think, continues to lie very much in its global city characteristics, as that hub connecting Asia to the rest of the world, akin to London and New York. Now, of course, that's about being a financial center, but it's a kind of services ecosystem around it, plus bits and pieces for Singapore of high-value manufacturing. And of course, now the challenge and the opportunity for Singapore is, as Asia's only one remaining global city, given that Hong Kong is rapidly exiting that stage, given what's happening in Hong Kong. And of course, we see some migration of this type of business under the radar from Hong Kong to Singapore. So there's opportunity there, certainly. But I think that opportunity takes place in a much more unwelcome, inclement global context for Singapore. The first best scenario for Singapore, and I think this is the scenario that Singapore's political and economic elite, which in its heart of hearts is still very pro-American, particularly in terms of, if you like, the softer power kind of things. With some exceptions, but mainly pro-American. Of course, it would like to see a continuity from the past. So the United States as, if you like, the geopolitical balancing power in Asia, not least to check China, but an open, rules-based, liberal economic order. That doesn't look like it's going to be the future. The alternative scenario, which I think would be the worst scenario for Singapore, is a shift from this order to a Pax Sinica with China as the dominant power in the region, both geopolitically and economically. That would be a much more mercantilist order with different rules of the game, both geopolitically and economically, also on the trade front. And I think Singapore's future as a global city would be, as we understand it today, would be much more compromised in this kind of order. And I think that's the kind of future that the elite here probably fears most, with some exceptions. And to put it again bluntly, this kind of future is the future of Singapore as a shadow of what's happening in Hong Kong today, maybe somewhat more muted. But we have an inkling of what might happen to Singapore maybe a couple of decades down the line if we look at what's happening in Hong Kong today. Now, there is, of course, an in-between scenario, somewhere between the two, where we don't effectively have one clear leader in the region. We have neither a Pax Americana nor a Pax Sinica, but something unstable and muddy, unclear in between. Singapore, of course, has a future in that kind of scenario as a sort of global city, as a city that economically connects this part of the world to other parts of the world, but probably not as rosy a future as it has had under that Pax Americana and liberal economic order.
Well, sobering thoughts, but I think these are important thoughts to consider. And I fully subscribe to your three scenarios. And I probably will not be able to assign very high degree of probability to the first scenario. The second and third look, more than say 30, 40%, if you will. Professor Razeen Sally, this has been extremely illuminating. I thank you very much for your time and insights.
Thank you very much, Tamo. Pleasure to be with you.
Oh, thank you. And thanks to our listeners as well. Kopi Time was produced by Martin Taki. Daisy Sharma and Violet Lee provided additional assistance. It is for information only and does not represent any trade recommendations. All 70 episodes of Kopi Time are available on YouTube and on all major podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify. As for our research publications, webinars, and live streams, you can find them all by Googling DBS Research Library. Have a great day.